So we've had two interesting sessions in the morning. In this session, I'm reminded of Walter Doran's comment this morning that cyberspace is a potentially new area of military domain after land, sea, and air. I would add that there's a potential fifth area of military domain could be outer space, which is emerging as a potential area of potential conflict. As you already know, outer space, particularly low Earth orbit, is a vital area for civilian infrastructure. There are satellites there that support Earth observation, GPS, air traffic control, agriculture planning, and on and on and on. It is a vital area for civilian economic infrastructure. Intermingled among these civilian satellites, however, are military satellites, including Earth observation satellites, communication satellites, all designed to either spy on your adversary or to support your terrestrial military activities. What is not yet in outer space are weapons, or at least not yet. And that's not for the lack of temptation to put weapons in outer space. When countries like Russia or China or the US see that their adversary is using military satellites to spy on them, there's a great deal of temptation to try and take kinetic action to destroy those weapons through what are called anti-satellite weapons, ASATs. And in fact, China tested an ASAT weapon in January of 2007, and Russia did the same in November of 2021. The result was massive debris field that then threatened the civilian satellites. So they quickly realized that's a bad idea. So we have been fortunate now that despite the longstanding militarization of space, we have not yet weaponized space. Whether that's due to technology or due to costs or due to fear of strategic interference with civilian weapons, or just good luck and common sense, we're not sure why. To help us to explain this, to help us understand why the weaponization of space has not yet led to the weaponization of space, we're lucky to have with us Paul Meyer and Jessica West. Paul, would you like to lead us off?
Okay, well, thanks, Habib. Great to be here. Always a pleasure to share a panel with Jessica. And I hope we'll be able to give you a little bit of insight into the dynamics behind the situation with outer space security. As we've noted, there's this sort of tension between militarization and weaponization. We've got the former, we maybe haven't yet gone to the latter, but there's definitely temptations in that regard. And, you know, I'd like to stress the importance really of outer space for global well-being and security. And to be more precise, it's to continue operations in that environment free from man-made threats. You know, there's obviously natural hazards in operating in outer space, and those can be daunting, but it becomes much more complicated if space operations are going to be targeted by states or non-state actors. Now, there's been an exponential growth in satellites, providing such a wide array of services on which global society is increasingly dependent. Indeed, even as someone working this area, I'm challenged to come up with the current numbers of active satellites in orbit. Because I would look at one database and no sooner I would find in another database there was yet another figure, and it's always going up all the time. And sometimes it's not quite clear if they're distinguishing between defunct satellites and active satellites, but suffice it to say, there's been an enormous growth in those, and the space-enabled services that go along with them. And it's also important to recognize that a lot of this growth is driven by the private sector rather than the public sector. Indeed, Elon Musk's Starlink satellite constellation alone amounts to close to half of all the active satellites in low Earth orbit. And without getting into a lot of orbital dynamics, that's the orbit closest to the Earth that is the most congested and utilized, particularly now for communications purposes, but also reconnaissance. So there's a contrast, though, maybe some would say a paradox, that while this growth is largely a result of the private sector and commercial firms, the governance of outer space remains a monopoly of states under our Westphalian international system, which is very state-centric. And therefore, it's subject to the vagaries of the state of relations amongst states, sometimes harmonious, often not so. Regrettably, the surge in outer space activity is coinciding with what seems to be something of a nadir in the level of cooperation among leading space powers. Although objectively, it would be in the interests of all spacefaring states, and indeed the totality of the international community, given the dependence on the services from space, that to cooperate to ensure that there would be continued safe and secure utilization of outer space. The current situation, however, is fraught with tension and mistrust. For over 40 years, the United Nations has sought to prevent an arms race in outer space, which, given that it's UN, you won't be surprised to hear it's often referred to by its abbreviation, PAROS, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. And besides the repeated declaration that this remains a common goal, there's scant evidence of serious efforts to realize it. Almost from the start in 1981, when the PAROS item was added to the agenda of the UN General Assembly and to the negotiating forum of the 65-nation Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, member states have held contending views as to how best to make progress on outer space security. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty, with 112 states parties, provided some common ground in calling for the peaceful uses of outer space, for the non-national appropriation of outer space, and for banning the stationing of weapons of mass destruction in orbit. But the Cold War era saw the development of space weapons, including anti-satellite weapons, the ASATs. And it demonstrated that the legal regime of the Outer Space Treaty was insufficient to ensure that peace would be kept in outer space. And this PAROS resolution, annually adopted by sometimes universal, sometimes just widely supported, one or two dissenters, it recognized this dilemma, if you will, and called for further measures to supplement the Outer Space Treaty to try, in fact, to reinforce and make more effective the existing legal regime, the legal regime of the Outer Space Treaty. Now, the broad consensus that the treaty did need some supplementary arrangements quickly broke down over what form these additional measures should take. One camp, led by China and Russia, but I hasten to add, also supported by a number of influential states like India and Brazil and Mexico and Indonesia and a number of others, favor legally binding agreements. They argue that only legal agreements, only treaties with the force of law will have the authority and staying power to ensure compliance with their provisions. Political measures at best could complement these, but could never substitute for legally binding instruments. The other camp, led by the United States and supported by many of its allies, that at this stage, it is best to develop politically binding measures, such as so-called transparency and confidence building measures. Adherents of this approach argue that the negotiation of a legally binding instrument would take too long and would flounder over issues like definitions of a weapon or verification. In their view, settling on a set of practical measures would be a quicker and more successful means of agreeing rules of the road, as it were, for state-conducted space operations. This argument over the best diplomatic path to take to prevent armed conflict in space has gone on for years without a resolution. In recent years, the relations among leading space powers have been marked significantly with mutual accusations of weaponizing outer space and the development of so-called counter space capabilities, essentially weapons of various forms. After a long hiatus in the testing of destructive ASATs, a series of these tests were conducted. You has mentioned some of them already, initially by China in 2007, then by the United States in 2008, then India in 2019, and most recently, the Russian Federation in November of 2021. And all of these destructive tests, and I should say they were all based on so-called kinetic ASATs, which essentially destroy their target by colliding into it. For those who know something about orbital dynamics, you won't be surprised to hear that all of these tests, to a greater or lesser extent, contributed to the already very disconcerting problem of space debris, which can linger for months, years, decades, centuries, depending on what altitude you have created it in. And that is threatening safe operations. And I think it's important to note it does so on an equal opportunity, non-discriminatory basis. It will not differentiate between your friendly satellite and your adversary's satellite. The debris can be pretty ruinous for either one. So regrettably, we have a space arms race that it appears to be escalating at the very time when self-interested restraint would be in order. The last 2 years has witnessed a new approach to the diplomacy of space security, which held much promise, but itself appears to have fallen victim to the hostile environment that I described above, hostile diplomatic environment. On the basis of a clever UK diplomatic initiative, the UN General Assembly authorized an open-ended working group, just to emphasize, as the title suggests, that means a group open to any member of the United Nations that wants to participate in it. And the theme of this open-ended working group is reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors. And this open-ended working group met for 4 sessions in 2022 and 2023, with its final session, its 4th and final session, concluding on the 1st of September of this year. Unfortunately, the group was not able to agree on a final report, and I should point out that this group operates on the so-called consensus rule that which increasingly is being interpreted as a unanimity rule, that nothing, no decision is taken that any member of the group objects to, that it failed to produce a final report, but it even failed to produce the usual procedural report, which is a non-substantive report. You know, basically just an accounting that these number of delegates met for this amount of time in this location, had this chairperson in place. Even that was, consensus was broken on, principally through the insistence of Russia. And for any of you who want to get some of the drama of UN procedures, which you can't always guarantee. I would suggest looking at the final session of the Open-Ended Working Group of September 1 on UN Web TV. It's archived, you can pick it up. Because the Russian delegate in particular, in his concluding statement, he was absolutely gleeful about the failure of this group. Of course, a failure largely attributed to his own action to deliberately reject compromise solutions. And indeed, as I mentioned, even to this gratuitous, almost insult of denying agreement of the procedure report. I mean, the General Assembly, after all, has put some money into these into this process, and to be even denied having that minimal kind of reporting in a way is almost insulting to the General Assembly's membership that authorized their working group. So in the face of this debacle, the UK ambassador tried to put a positive gloss on the proceedings. In his concluding statement, he explained the initiative was aimed at, quote, breaking the stalemate we perceived in multilateral diplomacy on outer space security, end of quote. He went on to note that, quote, given the complex and rapidly changing nature of the outer space domain, in which many capabilities are dual use or opaque, we need an approach that proceeds from the basis of behaviors of states rather than just the capabilities they possess. End of citation. Finally, he made an appeal that, quote, we should use the full range of normative tools available to us, whether legally binding or non-legally binding measures, and suggested that states should use the tools at hand to mitigate threats now. Final quotation, we simply do not have the luxury of further inaction. End of quotation. It is likely that supporters of the Open-Ended Working Group will move to extend this process via a new authorizing resolution next month, actually this month during the General Assembly. Canada was one of 34 states supporting a joint statement delivered by the Philippines delegation at the conclusion of the session, which voiced appreciation for the process, quote, which has inspired open, substantive, interactive, and enlightening discussions pertaining to outer space security, end of quotation. And the statement indicated that the legally and politically binding approaches were not mutually exclusive, and expressed the view that a follow-up process to the Open-Ended Working Group would be useful. And indeed, the UK delegation to the first committee meeting this month has tabled a draft resolution calling for a kind of OEWG Mark II that would operate in the years 2025 and 2026 with the existing mandate, as noted, of reducing space threats. While I and many in civil society and the private sector would agree that a continuation of an inclusive intergovernmental discussion of outer space security is desirable, there will be little merit in one if it only serves as a platform for the opposing camps to talk past one another. Even if it might be cumbersome, I think the time has come to recognize that neither the legal or political camp is going to prevail over the other. This suggests that two negotiating processes should be launched under UN auspices. One, to develop a set of transparency and confidence building measures supporting greater transparency and safer operations in outer space. And the other, to begin the work to elaborate a legally binding instrument that would incorporate measures to prevent armed conflict in outer space and reinforce the existing legal regime represented by the Outer Space Treaty. So even this Solomonic conclusion may not be easy to bring about, but it will be preferable to continuing the heated, adversarial, and ultimately unproductive debate over which diplomatic road to take to realize the longstanding goal of preventing an arms race in outer space. Thank you.
Your question that we got, I think, a few days ago was quite prescient. I'm not even sure that my boss Caesar knows this, but once upon a time, I proposed to write my PhD dissertation on that question: why has space not been weaponized? And my answer was going to be that there's a norm of non-weaponization, and I was going to go out and do research and show how this norm came to be. And then I wrote on something completely different. So many years later, you ask that question, and my answer is different. And my answer now is, are we sure space has not been weaponized? I no longer confidently say that space has not been weaponized. And I can walk you through a few examples. We have certainly seen no shortage of downright crazy proposals for almost unbelievable weapon systems in space over the years. Mostly those didn't come to be because of physics and costs, and sometimes things are easier to draw than they are to actually put in orbit. And so we've lucked out in some cases. But today, we have certainly seen ground-based weapons that target outer space, as we've heard. There are also capabilities for directed energy that have been used against satellites from Earth, but we don't know that they're not on orbit. We have cyber capabilities, certainly that can operate from Earth, but we don't know if they're in orbit. We don't know if jammers are, I would suspect that jammers are in orbit. We have a lot of dual purpose capabilities, going back kind of to the AI panel this morning and Branka's remarks about there not being civil and military AI. Well, when it comes to advanced robotics and maneuverability in outer space, we don't have civil and military capabilities. We just have capabilities. And some of these are developed to do fabulous things, like hopefully someday remove junk from outer space and service satellites so that they can operate longer and don't become junk in outer space. But we know that they can also be used to harm a satellite. And there's lots of rumblings in the news from the United States about China recently using a robotic arm, which, by the way, the Canadarm was reputedly called a weapon by Russia in the Cold War. Not a weapon, but this will get to my point. But China it grappled one of its own satellites and moved it to graveyard orbit, which, by the way, is a very good thing. It didn't become junk. But it could grapple someone else's satellite and move it to graveyard orbit as well. And in the Cold War, we came much closer. Russia had a fractional orbital bombardment system that was intended to deliver nuclear weapons from orbit. We kind of didn't say anything about it. We kind of let it slide. And, people will say, well, they didn't put the nuclear weapons on it. So it didn't violate the Outer Space Treaty. But, the hardware was up there, and it was up there for a long time. It operated for about a decade. And more recently, we know that China has demonstrated something very similar, but it is intended to release a hypersonic glide vehicle. There are space planes in orbit, and we quite frankly don't know what they do. And we don't know what kind of capabilities they have. And so I'm not confident saying anymore that we haven't weaponized space. I just don't know how exactly. And so I don't think we have a norm of non-weaponization. I think we have a norm of not talking about weapons in space. And I think it's been a very productive norm for the potential weaponization. And at least for the accelerated militarization. And I think those have become increasingly close. I think the distinction is more difficult to make these days. How do we get there? I think the flip side is someone asked me to write about why don't we have arms control in space? And I was like, well, there's lots of good reasons. And then I did more thinking, and I thought about this norm of not talking about space weapons. And there's a great book by a colleague, Blevin Bowen, on it's called Original Sin, and he talks about space power. And his argument in this book is that the original sin in space was launching a military satellite and making it militarized from the get-go. And my argument to him is, I think the original sin is really calling that peaceful. And I think we live in a fog of peace in outer space. We constantly tell the story of the peaceful use of outer space. And we've used that story to cover everything else up. And so military capabilities are peaceful. Everything is essentially peaceful and can be justified in some ways almost as peaceful. So when we see anti-satellite tests, those get justified by states using the language of peaceful uses. When we hear about Russia releasing a projectile from a satellite that came from a satellite that came from a satellite, well, that was a satellite servicing experiment. That was peaceful. And I think we have this fog of peace that makes it really difficult to see and understand and point out the non-peaceful uses. And so I think that has been a huge challenge. In other domains, we generally trot weapons out. I mean, some states have parades. In outer space, nobody has a weapon. we really try not to talk about it. And maybe it's because it's taboo, but I also think that we've been able to hide behind the narrative of peace. And in many cases, it's a myth. And we need to do more to emphasize what peace looks like and what peace does not look like. So I was speaking to someone in the military yesterday, and he said, you know, the best thing we ever did was keep quiet when Sputnik was launched. And I think we've kept quiet ever since on many, many, many issues. And I don't think it's positive. You can't control or restrict what you don't admit exists. And when no one has weapons and when nothing counts as a weapon because everything has some sort of peaceful use or could be used for peaceful purposes, you can't control that. And so I think we get stuck in this myth of the non-weaponization, if you will. It might explode. There's certainly a defense race in outer space, I would say. More and more states are talking about having defensive capabilities in space. Again, we don't talk about weapons. We're just going to have self-defense. That might be lasers, that might be kinetic capabilities, that might be jammers. It's not very clear. We also have commercial. Walter Dorn talked about how cyber is overwhelmingly governed by commercial interests. And we see a lot of that coming out even on the security side of outer space. As it becomes more commercialized, there's more demands for defense in space. We talk about counter space weapons, as Paul said, again, but we don't usually use weapons. We'll say counter space capabilities, because these aren't weapons. These are counter and even counter space capabilities. So I would say we just don't talk about what's happening in space very well. We don't have appropriate language, and the language we do use shrouds what's happening. So that's kind of my answer. I don't see that improving. I think Paul, you're going to get what you want when it comes to UN First Committee. There's now another proposal that's going to drop, I've heard, any day now, to have a second open-ended working group at the same time as the existing open-ended working group focused on legally binding instruments to run in parallel. And so this gap, I think, also allows us not to actually talk about weapons in space. And the first one is on norms of behavior. It's something I have been supportive of, but the objective here is not to deal with hardware and capabilities. It's really focused on behavior because we can't define a weapon. Nisha asked, what is a weapon? We don't define it in law. Well, we just don't acknowledge it in space. And so that continues. And then on the other side, on the legally binding, again, there's been a reticence to define, but also to acknowledge weapons. And so you have states who have done things that kind of look like weapons in space who are calling for non-weapons in space. And it's really hard to have trust. And they're also very reluctant to say what a weapon is. They're reluctant to discuss definitions, and they're reluctant to discuss verification. And I kind of think the outcome is most states are going to eventually shrug. We've had terrific engagement over the last few years. Many, many states without even space capabilities have been engaged in diplomacy. They see themselves as stakeholders in space. They're putting forth proposals. I think if we have two parallel processes, I mean, my spirit might die very slowly. And I think a lot of smaller states in particular are just going to say a curse on both your houses. I can't afford to participate in both of these dialogues. Best friends of each group will show up, and I think we'll get nowhere. And eventually we'll find ourselves in a situation where it's more obvious that perhaps there are weapons or harmful capabilities in space, and we'll kind of wonder how we got here. And I would say we sort of sleptwalked there from the 1950s onward. So it's kind of depressing, but there's a lot of great things. There's a lot of great things about space as well. We could talk about that later, but yeah, that's my answer to your question.
Thank you very much. Before we go to questions, thank you both. Before we go to questions, let me pose my own just because it's my challenge as moderator. Jessica, if you say that weaponization of space has basically started, even if we don't want to admit it, it's effectively going on. Is it therefore inevitable that it's going to grow and become more serious and we get things that we simply can't deny are weapons? And if so, we then go back to Paul's comments that if the answer then is some kind of mechanism, and Paul suggests, and you mentioned it, parallel processes of one, trying to achieve greater transparency, and two, trying to prepare some legally binding mechanism. And yet in 2008, that's exactly what we tried. The Europeans proposed the Code of Conduct on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And I sat through many of those. I tried to participate through many of those. And clause 1 is mine, by the way, even though it went, thank you, that was mine. But that went nowhere. At the same time, the Russians and the Chinese proposed a legally binding treaty on the prohibition of weapons in outer space at the CD. And that was simply a non-starter. So in a sense, we've tried. Should we try again? Is there no other option?
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever actually acknowledge weapons. I think I was actually struck by Brock's comment and the asterisks in China and AI. And for China, everything's defensive, sort of like in space, nothing's a weapon. And I think we'll stick to that. I think everything will be defensive capabilities, self-defense in space, the right to protect yourself. And that can lead to a slippery slope. But I don't think I think we'll accuse others of having weapons as we do. But I think there will be more defensive capabilities because states are feeling very insecure in outer space. I don't think there will be restrictions because, quite frankly, I don't think any state, even those calling for a legally binding instrument, actually want restrictions. Again, because nothing's a weapon. And it's double speak, at least that's my sense. There's a lot of double speak. And so, yes, let's ban weapons, but that's not a weapon, and that's not a weapon, and that's not a weapon. And, Tanisha's going, what's a weapon? And, a weapon, they mean space-based interceptors, which are not happening. But there are a lot of other things that are happening that are harmful. And so is cyber a weapon? Are lasers weapons, or are those just tracking stuff? And so I don't think we're going to get anywhere. I think like in AI, like in cyber, states are very wary of constraining themselves against future options. This sense of uncertainty makes them very unwilling to have limits. So my approach, something I think works, is more what Paul was talking about. I think defining what peaceful looks like. So maybe we stop talking about what is a weapon and what is a non-peaceful use, and we sort out what does peaceful look like. If you're using this technology in a peaceful way, what kind of conduct do you display when you do it? Do you notify people ahead of time? Do you provide your orbital information ahead of time? Do you coordinate and consult with other operators in the vicinity ahead of time so that you're safe? And provide a lot of transparency about what you're doing. And I think that slowly would start differentiating some of the helpful versus harmful applications of technology, and then give more leeway to point to the harmful stuff, or at least point to the stuff that's not fitting the picture of peace. But I think we need to define peace better. And we just haven't done that. And we've let it slide and stretch and become this huge balloon that can encompass everything, even weapons.
Yeah, just note, and you referred to the EU-initiated International Code of Conduct, which was a politically binding measure, and the so-called PPWT, the Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Outer Space, which was a draft treaty that Russia and China presented. But I would say in a diplomatic critique that the processes were quite flawed in both cases. The EU wanted to hold the pen and hold on to it. So that code was very much a made in Brussels perspective, and they would have what we refer to in the trade as hub and spoke type consultations. They'd go and speak to a nation about their plans, hear the views, go back to Brussels and either change it or not change it. And in many cases, it was not changing it in light of the views. So a number of non-Western spacefaring nations particularly had had enough. And they said, in my mind, fairly justly, that look at, we're not going to be summoned to the table to sign on to something that we haven't really had a chance to develop jointly and on an equitable basis. If we're not opposed to the notion of code and conduct, but then, you know, bring it into the United Nations, get a mandate for an inclusive negotiation, and, you know, we'll see you. EU didn't want to sacrifice that kind of control. You know, this was its little sort of a little medal, if you will, that they hoped they would be able to pin on their own chest at the end, and it was a misreading. Similarly, Russia and China, they came with this draft treaty, but they insisted it stay within the Conference on Disarmament. Now, for those who may know a little something about that, that conference hasn't been able to agree on a program of work or implement it since 1996.
Go to die.
And so they would not be, and the outer space item, the Paris item, was only one of 7 items actively sort of figuring on the agenda. So their refusal, in a sense, to have this idea considered in other fora also essentially confined it to the trash bin of history, to pick up a Marxist term. And the twin approach, and it's not really efficient, it's cumbersome, but, you know, sometimes that's what's needed for achieving an agreement, particularly in a consensus-based forum. So I'll give you the example of cybersecurity policy. Again, something that's been under some active consideration. Some similar tensions with some similar states. And in 2018, to the dismay of many, including myself, what had been a consensus approach, i.e. that there was one resolution that was supported, often, you know, without a vote, on moving ahead with consideration of what norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace would represent. You'll see the similarity of the formulations. Yet there was no willingness to compromise. The lead sponsors, Russia on one hand, US on the other, weren't willing to come together and hammer something out. So the General Assembly was forced, in their sublime wisdom, to adopt 2 parallel processes, which is what happened. We had an open working group, and we had a group of governmental experts. They carried on, and to the surprise of many, both actually were able to come up with agreed reports, consensus-approved reports. And it's not to say that we've resolved all the problems relating to norms of responsible behavior in cyberspace, and there's, you know, now currently another open-ended working group considering these things, but it did not prove as detrimental as many thought initially. So I suspect we're going to have something similar. We won't probably have long to wait. And the question remains if there's sufficient self-interest. And I think one of the distinctions here, maybe that does not apply to cyberspace, is this mutual interest in not wrecking it up and not polluting, because it will negate everyone's space operations there. So there is an inherent proclivity, I would say, for self-restraint. I think apropos of what Jessica suggested, weaponization is sort of the term that no one wants to use, even as they're playing around the edge. She referred to taboo. Actually, you know, taboos can be helpful. You know, it suggests that there's a predisposition not to screw up this domain, and therefore that action that would do that is stigmatized to degree. And I think we saw that in the reactions to the destructive ASAT tests. Not to say that that taboo was strong enough to prevent the acts themselves, but I think it led to some opprobrium and also a further mobilization of diplomatic steps to try to address it, which is what the UK initiated open-ended working group did, also trying a new tack in looking at, okay, if we have problems of definition, et cetera, with capabilities in traditional arms control, well, let's look at behavior. It's what you do with whatever you have. And if it damages or disrupts the normal functioning of a spacecraft, that shouldn't happen. And though it was a failure in terms of agreed reports, there were a lot of good and promising ideas that came forward during the weeks of the Open and Working Group in terms of cooperation. And I hope, again, with the momentum of both the increasing use of space and the recognition that things could be damaging, actions would be damaging for all space parties, that we'll be able to get some agreement on measures that would be helpful in keeping the dogs of war at bay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So let's open the floor now to questions. Everybody knows where the microphone is. Please.
Hi, Arndt Jorgensen. Question for Jessica, but Paul might want to comment on it as well. One thing that I think plays very much into your observation of not saying what's actually going on in space and the blurry lines involved in that was an incident that I'm sure you're aware of, which is when Elon Musk apparently denied Ukraine access to Starlink in order to launch an attack on territory within Russia, which it sort of indicates the dual use of Starlink in certain ways, both in a military and a civilian capacity, but also the blurry lines of authority about who exactly controls these kinds of things when it falls into the hands of an unelected entrepreneur to make these kinds of rather crucial decisions. I just wonder whether you would want to comment on that at all.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the American government thinks Elon's a blessing and a curse all at the same time. I mean, I think that's more to our discussion this morning on cyber and the participation, the blurring of civilian and military applications of space, and opens up those questions about who's a target, how do you target military applications that are actually commercial but have a lot of civilians on the other side. And that's a theme that we're also hearing in these same forums where we don't talk about weapons. There's a lot of talk, especially from Russia, about targeting commercial satellites that illegally participate in militarized activities. And that's the language they use. And it's as though they forget that they have a military space program. That's changing the tone, and that was introduced in the open-ended working group as well, that these commercial operators are targets. We will retaliate against commercial operators who are providing Ukraine with imagery, with communications, with broadband, with targeting in some cases. Starlink was being used to facilitate drone targeting, and that violated the user agreement. And so Elon spoke out against that as well. So that's a whole other mess on Earth. And that would likely open up things like cyber interference, which we've seen, certainly, and questions about what counts as civilian, what counts as critical infrastructure. We also don't talk about the overlap between cyber and space very often, but we have a norm. Paul was talking about the discussions on cyber to create norms of behavior, and one of them is about not targeting essential civilian services, critical infrastructure. But at our space meetings, China says we can't talk about cyber because that's not space, that's Earth, and we already have agreements on that, and states don't even want to acknowledge that those norms might also apply to outer space. So it's like another gap where bad things can fall into and kind of get overlooked.
Well, just the ICRC has pointed out the heavy dependence of global society on satellites for many essential civilian surfaces and structures. And as with cyber, they've advocated that it be no action taken against spacecraft satellites that would have a detrimental impact on essential civilian needs and services. Now, they have suggested that there be a segregation between the military satellites and civilian satellites, which is understandable from an IHL only perspective. It will make things neater, but I think very impractical in the real world, since there's such extensive use of dual use. So many civilian, telecommunication satellites that may have 90% of their functionality related to civilian uses, but carry payloads 10% for military communications. And even that amount would make it a legitimate target. As Jessica already referred to, this is further complication that we're not even talking about just state-conducted activity, but non-state actors in the private sector, commercial companies engaging in support of armed conflict of one belligerent or the other, which again endangers their status. So there are a number of interacting developments here that will make it hard to ensure. I think the segregation is not likely. You may just have, as we do in cyber from 2015, have a norm. Again, they're not so readily monitored or verified in terms of compliance with the norm. Jessica's referred to the problems in outer space in that regard, though I think it's one of the drivers behind looking for the transparency and accountability measures so that there is actually a greater transparency about what you're doing. There's something called the Registration Convention, which obliges any state that launches a satellite to register with the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs. And I think to date, there's never been one satellite designated as a military satellite. It's all there for science and the greater good of science. So a little bit back to the point about, this is the activity that we dare not say its name, and yet it's obviously it has been going on since the dawn of the space era.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Levon Bond. I'm coming from defense, like my colleague before. So I would like to build off your point, Jessica, politely disagree with you, Paul, and perhaps anticipate the next session, because I found it really interesting that you don't know what's out there in terms of space, Jessica. You don't know what the weaponization is. You don't really understand, like, we don't have a good picture of what the weaponization of space is. And so I think the issue isn't so much that we don't talk about it, is that we don't admit it. It's the obfuscation, it's the lack of transparency. And I think that the challenge is when we have a norm and we have conventions that outline the non-weaponization of space, that provides a blanket cover that a lot of countries are using to mask their programs. And so I think it would be far more productive for us to just admit space is weaponized. It is weaponized. From the military perspective, we plan for either a denied or degraded space environment. So there was discussion of, going back to map and compasses, developing weapon systems that aren't as dependent or reliant on GPS, being able to operate in both environments at once, because we expect that that's probably going to happen, because we know that our adversaries as well as our allies are developing capabilities, as you've pointed out, dual use, that have the ability to disrupt, but we don't know to what degree, and we don't know how much, and we don't know how, because there's no transparency. And so I think of back to the beginning of arms control verification in the nuclear realm, and how once we started admitting that we were building nuclear weapons and started a regime of verification and treaties about that limited certain uses of weapons, that the world felt a lot safer and more secure within the nuclear weapons threat, because at least we had a better understanding of one another and we were being more transparent. And I think that's where we are right now. It's more a matter of lack of transparency. And if a regime of some sort of verification could be built where we admit the weapons that we're using and then try to limit the use and accept that space has been and will be weaponized by our adversaries, and then move from there to just so that way we're not as afraid and we're not acting out of that fear. So I guess for the panelists, just a comment on the idea of having more of a verification as opposed to a complete ban on the weaponization of space.
And I wonder, I mean, is verification in outer space even possible?
Okay, so there's never 100% verification, and I think we need to move on from that. My own approach is you have layered systems that start with transparency and you add layer after layer. So I think we could deal somewhat with that. It's an interesting proposal you make. We do talk about weapons from other states more in the last 3 years than we ever had. And so China calls the US MEV a weapon, and they have done that at the United Nations, and the United States I'm fairly sure has called the Chinese arm a weapon. So there's still a lot of accusations, but nobody wants to go out and say they have anything other than defensive capabilities. And in part, so I think it would be risky. And what you're proposing is what happened with the operational domain approach. And I think this is where the United States, if I'm going to give them a charitable interpretation of their warfighting in space language, I think the goal was to start to admit that outer space was being used in aggressive ways, that there's aggressive capabilities. We want to bring it to the light. Mostly we want to bring what our adversaries are doing to light. And we want to admit that we are operating from a defense and protection approach in outer space. And I would say that is hugely backfired, at least at the diplomatic level. And statement after statement at the UN is like, we reject the United States statement that space is a warfighting domain or a domain of operation or a future battlefield. And so part of it might be stuck with that taboo thing. And then you have Russia and China who say, absolutely no way. Space is exclusively peaceful purposes. There is no weapons allowed in space. And you get stuck there with, they're the ones doing it. So I don't know. I see where you're going. Greater transparency. I also think it's diplomatically hard to admit what one is doing because we have this myth of peaceful use where everything's peaceful and we don't talk about non-peaceful. And to me, that makes it hard to regulate. So I don't know. I just feel like the US has been paying a price for starting to talk about space as an operational domain. I know Canada calls space an operational domain, a domain where they see their resources as contested, where they have to be prepared to be able to operate without those resources in case they're denied or degraded at some point. But I just know at the diplomatic level, it's not translating well. It's translating into you're weaponizing space. You're the problem. And then it goes both ways. No, you're weaponizing, but we only have defensive, peaceful capabilities to protect ourselves from you.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, there is a distinction. The Outer Space Treaty does designate activity in space for peaceful purposes and in the interest and for the benefit of all countries. Also, the ban on sovereign appropriation or any claim of sovereignty in outer space. So, those are some important conflict prevention measures. And I like to point out that think of all the wars down here on Earth that are a function of territorial disputes or clashes of sovereign claims. So that I think is a background that has this predisposition, not to engage in aggression in outer space. Plus the realities of the orbital dynamics that I referred to earlier. I think it's true we have scant success with preventive arms control and preventive disarmament. Usually the pattern is the weapons are developed, deployed, and then we start talking about controlling them, reducing them, in some cases actually eliminating them. But that has been the pattern. And I think there is a case along the lines that you suggest to put cards on the table, recognize that there are capabilities that could be used in a destructive fashion, and have some cooperative security measures developed regarding them in terms, I think, particularly of restraint measures. And there is this underlying common interest in continuing to use the orbits in space in a safe way. And I think, that could be a help. But it's true, hiding in the shadows, mutual accusation that the other guy started it and I'm just responding is ultimately pretty fruitless. Similar sense that arguing to the nth degree, the relative merits of politically binding over legally binding, also
Stick to your agreements regardless, please.
Yeah, it becomes a problem. I would just note one thing too, which I think is a problem, that when we have international law here, states have at times been loath to invoke it. When China had its 2007 ASAT test generated, was it 1,800 pieces of enduring debris? Few countries, if any, invoked the Outer Space Treaty, which has an article that compels a state that is going to take action that potentially could have harmful interference with other states' party space activities, that they had an obligation to consult. Beijing did not observe that requirement, but what was, I think, unsatisfactory was few states called them out on it, invoking it. And you can only surmise why not, because they didn't maybe want those constraints of the Outer Space Treaty parroted back to them if they were planning something. Well, that's really problematic. If we have a widely supported treaty based on agreed self-restraint in the mutual common interest, then we weaken the authority of international law if we're not prepared to call out violations of that law. So there's another problem too here. I always like to point out, because I follow both, but the big advantage always has over cyberspace, this is actually a widely supported foundational treaty that set out some really important principles and provisions. And we have to, as the annual resolution the General Assembly says, work to make that regime more effective and consolidate and reinforce it, but definitely don't undermine it going forward.
But to your point, just because quickly you mentioned nuclear, and I think where your suggestion plays better is at a bilateral level. So quieter conversations, bilateral exchanges of information and development of understandings, especially because so few states have the capabilities that we're talking about. But at the UN level, it's so performative, and every state is striving to show how they're the defender of peaceful use only. And there are just, there are none that I know of channels of communication on space between major powers, and it's dangerous. They don't have hotlines. They don't have ways to contact each other. They use Twitter. They don't know who to call. They use diplomatic notes. And you can't resolve situations that way or exchange and develop shared understandings that way. So I think where it might work more quietly, not that I'm legitimizing weapons, but there's a lot of gray capabilities that could be harmful and could not be harmful, but where those understandings and rules might play out better was if we had bilateral discussions, and we're just not at a political moment where we seem to have those anymore. We put everything in the open and in public, and it turns into a performance, and we get nowhere.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. Last question.
Try to make this hurry, but I want to give it a little context. I don't know with the forum that you're in, how much the diplomats and experts there are closer to the political realm versus the scientific, or a combination of both. I worked at the government for 3 decades, and the scientific illiteracy of civil servants and politicians was appalling. Now, I almost hate to think about this subject or bring it up in public because I'm afraid and telepathically it may be picked up as an excuse for weaponizing space. When Harper was trashing the government scientific community, I lost my job as a futurist. I wasn't a scientist, but I spent my time talking with scientists and emergency managers to see whether there could be more prediction of emergencies and then tools developed to help emergency responders. There's a subject that often politicians don't like to talk about things which are on long-term timeframes, where at any given moment, the risk is low, but over a time, cumulative, it is big. One of the things that I was working on in general package was existential risks causes emergencies. And one thing I was working with the Canadian Space Agency on and National Defense and Center for Security Science was planetary defense. And the UN has been working on this. The UN has gotten the astronomers community engaged in watching for the threat of potentially hazardous objects, PHOs or NEOs, near Earth objects. Now, the two popular movies, Armageddon and Deep Impact, showed go and kick it with a nuke. A lot of scientists have dismissed that, but I've been studying the scientific literature. I've spotted a half dozen ways you could deal with a dangerous object headed for the Earth. One of them is nuclear. Now, I'm concerned whether or not at some point if the astronomer community gets excited and talks about something, the latest was this, we're in threat in 175 years. Whether or not to be a threat that would emerge would be in 2 and 3 years, whether or not somebody might say, well, we're going to have forward deployment of explosive impactors, and the moon is a convenient place. Have you all heard of any discussion of this potential excuse? And I think probably the resistance because so much of the world's political leadership is scientifically illiterate.
I'm going to say I'm glad I haven't. I think the moon is a potentially slippery slope for getting very close but not touching on military capabilities. I do think there's a clear restriction on weapons in military, much clearer than in Earth orbit. I do know people that work on planetary defense. The last I heard is a giant explosion. The force of gravity is such that the thing would just suck itself back together. So now we're looking at nudging off orbit. How they do that, I don't know. I'm not a scientist, and I might have to count myself amongst the scientific illiterate. But I'm glad I have not. But I won't deny there are no shortage of bad ideas out there, as Caesar said this morning. And I think it's on all of us to be vigilant and to call out the bad ideas, and hopefully to call them out in a way that shows they don't make sense. We can't afford it, and the technology won't work, so let's move on.
Yeah, I mean, there's explicit prohibition on militarization of the moon and celestial orbits in the Outer Space Treaty. That's very clear. And actually, I think planetary defense is one of the sort of positive stories in terms of international collaboration in the scientific community. There's a lot going on, and I for one of these, can sleep soundly at night, not worrying that we're going to be demolished by a near-Earth object.
Thank you both for a very interesting discussion. I'm not sure we reached any conclusion. I think we realize there's a problem. We're just not sure what the problem is. I think we realize the solution is needed, but we don't know what the solution is. And so for a moment, we're living in a world of wishful thinking and being happy. I think sometimes it's okay to believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. Thank you all. Let's go into the next session.